If sleep isn't quite coming tonight, you're in exactly the right place. My name is Jo, and this is Quietive, a channel devoted entirely to helping you rest through gentle, slow storytelling. Tonight's story takes us inside the English pub, where it came from, what it meant to the people that kept it alive, and why it is still here after nearly 2,000 years. There's nothing urgent in it, nothing that needs your full attention. You're welcome to just let it wash over you, to follow only the parts that catch your interest, and then you can drift off entirely whenever sleep decides to come. So make yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and I'll do the rest. This is the story of the English pub. Not one pub, all of them. Nearly 2,000 years of them, starting with a Roman wine shop on a muddy road in occupied Britain and ending, more or less, with wherever your nearest English pub happens to be. England doesn't usually tell its history quietly, but this one is quiet, and all the steadier for it. No battles, no grand speeches, just a door that's been open in one form or another. No battles, no grand speeches, just a door that's been open in one form or another for an extraordinarily long time. Where it begins, as it happens, in Rome. Rome arrived in Britain in 43 AD, when a Roman army crossed the Channel and began its occupation of the island, bringing with it roads, towns, law, and a considerable talent for building things that outlasted the people who built them. Among those things was the taberna, which was quite simply a wine shop, practical and functional, built alongside Roman roads to serve the troops moving through the new province. The problem was that the people already living in Britain didn't really care much for wine. What they drank was ale, thick and unhurried, brewed without hops, from malty barley or oats, tasting of grain and thyme and very little else. And that preference wasn't going to change just because Rome had arrived. And so the taberna adapted. Wine gave way to ale, and the word taberna softened over several centuries of daily use to something we still reach for without thinking: tavern. 367 years after arriving, the Roman legions left, recalled to defend an empire crumbling on too many fronts, and Britain, at the far edge of everything, was released. The taverns didn't leave with them. The building stayed, the habit stayed, the ale stayed, and as for the Roman supply routes collapsed and importing became impossible, the taverns didn't leave with them. The building stayed, the habit stayed, the ale stayed, and as the old Roman supply routes collapsed, the imported wine became nearly impossible to source. Locally brewed ale settled into its position as the drink of an ordinary Englishman, where it has remained, more or less, ever since. Let that settle for a moment. The foundations of every English pub, laid in Roman stone for several centuries after the Romans departed, through the Anglo-Saxon years and the Viking raids and the slow process of England becoming England, and the alehouse was run almost entirely by women. She was called an alewife, or sometimes a brewster, which was simply the female form of brewer, and her operation began at home with her household's grain. Ale was brewed first for the family because water was unreliable, and ale, however modest, was at least nourishing and unlikely to make you ill, and when she produced more than the household needed, the surplus went to neighbours, and when that trade grew into something proper, a room of the house became a place where people could come, sit and drink. To signal that the ale was ready, she would hang something above the door: a green brush, a bundle of straw, or a long wooden bowl, called an ale stake. These simple markers would eventually evolve into the elaborate village of St. Lawrence in Ludlow, a carving made in the 15th century shows an alewife being thrown into hell by demons, still clutching her short measure pot, and it tells you something about how the figure of independent female brewer had become to unsettle people by that period. By 1450, commercial brewing had shifted rapidly into male hands, driven by larger operations, licensed premises and formal regulation, and in 1540 the city of Chester banned women between the ages of 14 and 40 from sailing ale altogether. For several centuries before that, though, quietly and domestically and without any particular fuss, the pub had been hers. The English have always kept a complicated relationship with their own drinking, loving the pub and being appalled by it in roughly equal measures, and that tension goes back almost as far as the pub itself. Around 965 AD, King Edgar of Wessex decided something had to be done. Alehouses had spread to a degree he found troubling, and he issued a decree limiting each village to one, no more, and he introduced something called the peg alongside it. A peg was a small wooden marker fitted inside a large communal drinking vessel, divided it into measured portions, and for each additional peg of ale consumed, you paid another penny. The idea was to make excess drinking visible and therefore, hopefully, slightly harder to ignore. Whether it worked is not recorded, but the peg gave us something that outlasted Edgar's reign by more than 1,000 years. The phrase "to take someone down a peg or two" is widely thought to have had its origins in those early hopeful attempts to put a measure on the English appetite for ale. A few decades on, the king, known perhaps a little unfairly as the Unready, introduced formal fines for rowdy behaviour in alehouses as part of his wantage law code, which represents some of the earliest recorded pub regulation England produced. King Henry III took a different approach in 1266 and appointed official ale inspectors whose job was to travel England, testing the quality of what was being sold, because ale was so central to the English diet, drunk almost by everyone, including children, since clean water was generally unreliable. That is, its quality was treated as a matter of public health rather than a personal preference. By 1552, Parliament had formalised all of this with an act requiring innkeepers to hold a licence, and when the government census counted every licensed premises in England and Wales in 1577, the total reached 17,959, nearly 9 in 10 of them alehouses, the rest inns and taverns. That works out to roughly one pub for every 142 to 200 people, a density of drinking establishment that is honestly rather difficult to picture now. By the medieval period, the inn and the tavern had become something well beyond a place to drink. Courts were held in them, harvests celebrated, news exchanged, community disputes settled, and anyone who needed to find someone to arrange something, or simply understand what was happening in the world beyond their own street, went to the alehouse to find out. Geoffrey Chaucer chose one of them as a starting point for what many consider the birth of English literature, and the choice tells you something about what the English pub already meant. The Canterbury Tales begins in 1383 with a group of pilgrims gathering at the Tabard Inn in Southwark on the south bank of the Thames. The landlord, a man called Henry Bailey, is described with real warmth, and he actually existed, appearing in contemporary records. Chaucer didn't invent him, he simply paid close attention to him. The Tabard itself stood for centuries before being demolished in 1876, and immediately next to where it stood, there is still a pub, the George Inn, owned now by the National Trust. Its galleried wooden courtyard largely intact. Shakespeare drank at the George during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, mentioning it by name in King John, and the courtyard with its tiered wooden galleries overlooking the central yard is thought to have directly shaped the design of as richly gilt burners, as perfectly dazzling when contrasted with the darkness and dirt outside, and the interior is even grander than the facade, with a bar of French polished mahogany, elegantly carved. Temperance campaigners were horrified. Magistrates threatened to pull licences, and newspaper columnists filled pages with warnings about public morals. And that's when the working people of England walked through the doors anyway, because inside it was warm and bright, and for a few pennies you could stand anywhere that felt, just briefly, like it was yours. That grandeur filtered into the Victorian pub more broadly, and by the second half of the 19th century a building boom was producing pubs of real ambition across England, introducing features that haven't gone anywhere. The hydraulic beer engine, a handpull at the bar drawing beer up from the casks in the cellar, the island bar where customers would be served from any side, decorative tile work, plate glass windows, and the snob screen. A snob screen is a small hinged panel of etched glass fitted at eye level in the bar, designed to allow middle-class customers to see the bar staff without being seen by or having to mix with the working-class customers in the adjacent bar. Both bars might be drawing from the same barrel, but the saloon bar customer paid a penny or two more and wasn't required to look at anyone they'd rather not. Only around 8 sets of authentic snob screens survive in English pubs today. One at the Lamb in Bloomsbury, another at the Prince Alfred in Maida Vale. These little small glass windows into a world where glass was so carefully maintained that even ordering a drink required its own architecture. Britain entered the First World War in August 1914, and 4 days later, on the 8th of the month, Parliament passed the Defence of the Realm Act, known by its acronym DORA, in a single day and without debate, handing the government sweeping powers over almost every aspect of civilian life. Among those powers was the ability to close the English pub. Before the war, a pub in England could legally open for 16 or 17 hours a day, but the concern during wartime was that workers in munitions factories were arriving for their shifts having drunk rather more than what was ideal, and accuracy matters a great deal when you're making shells. David Lloyd George, serving as Minister for Munitions, declared publicly in 1915 that Britain was fighting 3 enemies: Germany, Austria and drink, and as far as he could see, the greatest of these deadly foes was drink. Under Dora, permitted pub hours were cut to noon until 2:30 in the afternoon, and then again from 6:30 until 9:30 in the evening, roughly 5.5 hours a day in total. While beer was watered down and duty on standard barrel was raised from 7 shillings and 9 pence to 23 shillings in the first year of the war alone, and for a period it became illegal to buy another person a drink. Standing around, that most English of gestures, that small, quiet act of belonging, was briefly a criminal offence on the grounds that it encouraged excessive consumption. The mandatory afternoon closing stayed in place for 74 years, and that's the part that tells you everything about how emergency measures became permanent ones. Lifted finally by the Licensing Act of 1988, it had long since stopped feeling like a wartime imposition to the people who grew up with it. 3 generations of English people knew the pub closed in the afternoon as simply how things were. Not a restriction, just England in the middle of the day. Also introduced British summertime. The clocks go forward in spring as a wartime measure in May 1616 to maximise daylight working hours, and that too has never gone away through the 20s and 30s, and then again in the built around a regular place. His findings, published in a study commissioned by Camera, the campaign for real ale, were striking. People who have a local, who go regularly and are known there, have more close friends, feel more satisfied with their lives, and feel more embedded in their communities than people who don't. And the reason isn't the alcohol, it's the room. It's the being somewhere where you are known. You didn't need to be interesting or well connected or particularly well dressed. Just showing up is the whole requirement. Just allow me a small digression here, because people in England are extraordinarily keen on knowing which English pub is the oldest, and it generates the kind of argument that is tremendous, pleasurable, and entirely unresolvable, which may be why it persists. At least 3 pubs currently hold the claim. The Ye Old Fighting Cocks in St Albans, Hertfordshire, points to the foundations dating to around 793 AD through historic England, though historic England describes the building as being of 16th century appearance, and the earliest documented record of it trading as an alehouse comes from 1756, where it was known as the Three Pigeons. Originally a pigeon house built by monks, the structure was moved to its current location after the dissolution of St Albans Abbey in 1539, and Oliver Cromwell is said to have spent a night there during the Civil War. It's octagonal, which is unusual, and it feels extremely old, which counts for a great deal. Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem in Nottingham holds the same claim, as does the Ye Old Man and Scythe in Bolton, and the Guinness World Records once maintained a record for the oldest pub before withdrawing it from the consideration in 2000 on grounds that it was impossible to verify. That withdrawal is, perhaps, the most English conclusion to that particular argument that anyone ever could devise. Now we reach the present day. At the end of 2024, approximately 38,989 pubs remained open in England and Wales, and that number has been falling steadily ever since, with a net loss of 412 in 2024 alone, roughly 6 closing every week. London seeing the most closures, followed by the West Midlands. Rising energy costs, staffing costs, business rates, and a generation of younger people who drink less have all played their part. In England in 2024, nearly 4 in 10 people aged 16 to 24 didn't drink alcohol at all. According to the British Beer and Pub Association, the sector still contributes more than £34 billion to the economy every year and supports more than 1 million jobs, and for every £3 spent in a pub, 1 goes directly to the government in tax. None of that quite captures what's actually lost when an English pub closes. It's not the building or the business exactly, but it's something harder to name than either of those. Communities have been pushing back. Pubs can now be listed as assets of community value, giving residents the right to bid before a building is sold. And the English pubs that remain, many of them are genuinely good, serving better food at almost any point in the pub's long history, and better beer too, real ale drawn from the cask, proper bitter and mild, the kind of carefully crafted beer that connects directly to what those medieval alewives were brewing centuries ago, with a renewed interest in the craft of brewing that the alehouse of the 13th century would have found entirely familiar. If you know where to look, and most English people do, you can still find it. Down a side street you've passed 100 times, perhaps, a door that looks as though it hasn't changed since before you were born, a low ceiling, the smell of old wood, and something that might be hops, or might be thyme, or might just be that particular smell of a room that's been full of people for a very long time. A fire, or the memory of one, someone behind the bar who knows your name, or will by the 3rd visit anyway. A few tables, mismatched chairs, dominoes in a box somewhere, waiting. Let's say it's a Tuesday afternoon. There's almost no one around. The light is coming through the window, and it's that of that particularly grey-gold autumn day feel boards in long, slow rectangles, and nothing is required of anyone in the room. No conversation, not performance, not any particular version of yourself. Just the warmth and the quiet and the faint knowledge that people have been sitting